The goal of this video is to provide a simple, effective, and efficient means of warming up, which prepares you to perform well while minimizing injury risk and doing all of this in the shortest time possible with the least amount of fatigue. The problem here is that highly fatiguing, ineffective warm-ups are almost like the standard among the average gym goer. Most of the approaches taken here not only hinder performance, but actually substantially increase the risk of injury. And in the case of highly fatiguing warm-ups, these often take much time and energy that could have been devoted towards the actual exercises that will push you closer to achieving your goals and diverts those resources away towards things which neither amplify performance or the actual amount of progress that you make and can often substantially decrease the amount of enjoyment that you experience throughout your workout. And with regards to people who just skip warm-ups altogether and instead opt for this sort of pyramid-like approach where they start off with a lower load for a certain number of reps and just increase their load and maintain the number of reps they're doing up until they get up to the max load that they're able to handle for that number of reps, you're effectively wasting both time and energy on those earlier sets and actually decreasing your performance on the later sets, which are the ones that had the potential to actually create a hypertrophic stimulus in the first place. So when you approach your workouts like this, you're not only just wasting a ton of energy on the front side, but you're actually reducing the amount of effective work you're able to do on the backside. So what is our solution here? The solution in a nutshell is to use the exercise that you are about to do working sets in as your warm up. And we'll get into exactly what I mean here and how to go about doing this in a way which creates minimal fatigue and potentiates performance and maximizes the stimulus you're able to provide to your target muscles in order to create those gains over time. So, to start, what is the goal of a warm up? Well, an ideal warm up exists to prepare your body to perform optimally and minimize the risk of injury in the shortest amount of time possible and while creating the least amount of fatigue possible. So, what are the key factors that an effective warm up needs to accomplish in order to meet this goal? Well, the first thing is that it needs to prepare your muscles, your joints, your connective tissue, and your nervous system for the load that it is about to handle. If you're about to do 405 on barbell back squat, you can't just walk up to the bar with 405 on it and immediately just get under it and expect to perform well. Not only does that substantially increase your risk of injury, but your nervous system, your connective tissue, your muscles have not been adequately primed in order to produce forces and perform the specific movement pattern which you are about to undertake. And that brings us to the second point of what a warm up needs to accomplish, and that's that it needs to prepare your nervous system and your muscles to move effectively and efficiently through the movement pattern that you're about to perform. Again, with the barbell back squat, if you are trying to use a leg extension to warm up for a barbell back squat, you can't expect to just, again, throw 405 on the bar and be totally warmed up and fresh for it and just able to do it right away. The nervous system recruitment and your ability to effectively execute a specific movement pattern is dependent upon you priming that specific movement pattern for your brain, your nervous system, your muscles, your connective tissue. You need to be able to move effectively in the specific movement pattern that you're about to undergo. Especially if this is a movement pattern which you only hit, let's say, once a week, which is very common. You haven't hit it in 7 days. So yeah, your body needs some time and some practice to really dial in. Where do I put my feet? Where do I put my hands? What cues do I need to remind myself of to really perform this movement effectively? All of those things need to be dialed in going into your working sets. And so that second point there is, again, prepping your body to perform the specific movement pattern which you are about to undergo for your working sets for that exercise. The third point is that we need to ensure that adequate blood flow and synovial fluid is being delivered to the relevant muscles, joints, and connective tissue in order to maximize performance and minimize our risk of injury. If you put a large amount of load on a joint that is just totally cold, I feel significantly stiffer and my joints feel much less lubricated and require a warm up in order to feel like my joints are really well lubricated and I'm moving smoothly through a given movement. And similarly, an effective warm up ensures that my muscles are all getting the nutrient delivery that they need to perform optimally. And so again, an effective warm-up needs to prepare your muscles, joints, and connective tissue, and your nervous system for the load that it is about to handle for your working sets. It needs to prepare your nervous system and your muscles to effectively perform the movement pattern which you're about to do for that given exercise. And it needs to ensure that adequate blood flow and synovial fluid is being delivered to the muscles, joints, and connective tissue that are involved in the movement you're about to undergo. Now, what does a warm up need to stay away from? Well, the first thing that we want to avoid in a warm up is excessive time investment. What I mean here is that if you're spending 20, 30, 40 minutes warming up for a workout, how much of that is taking away from time which you could have spent performing actual exercises and working sets that would have elicited adaptations, actually pushing you further towards your goals, as opposed to just spending all of this time warming up, doing things which are not actually creating adaptations and which do not further you towards your goals. So we want to find an effective warm up that we can accomplish in the shortest amount of time possible so that we can put as much time as possible into the things that actually push us further towards our goals. To elaborate on this, if you're doing a pre-exhaustion exercise, so let's say you're doing some exercise for your quads, going into another exercise for your quads, you are providing a hypertrophy stimulus in both of those exercises for your quads. And thus, yes, you will create some level of fatigue in the target musculature in both of those instances. However, both of those things are creating a robust hypertrophy response. The second thing that we want to avoid in a warm up is excessive fatigue costs. There are a couple different parameters of fatigue that we want to avoid here. So, fatigue in target muscles. That is, if the goal is to perform optimally for our working sets, and we know that it's very important to be able to perform near muscular failure for working sets in order to create adaptation to become stronger, grow bigger, and create that effective hypertrophy stimulus, we know that it's important to be able to perform highly for those working sets. So if you're fatiguing your target muscles going into your working sets, in a way which simply creates fatigue but doesn't actually elicit a adaptation or a hypertrophy response, that simply makes it so you are less capable of producing the force necessary and the performance necessary to create the adaptations which you're in the gym to create in the first place. This next thing is that we want to avoid creating excessive fatigue in supporting musculature. What I mean here is that if your goal is to create a high degree of force and a high degree of stimulation in a target muscle, you want that target muscle to be the limiting factor during your working sets for a given exercise. And if you are creating an excessive amount of fatigue in supporting musculature going into those working sets, then your target muscles might not be the limiting factor. You might be limited by that supporting musculature, thus limiting the actual stimulus you're able to provide for your target muscles. So, limiting fatigue in the supporting musculature is of a very high degree of importance. Next, we want to limit cardiovascular fatigue going into our working sets and going into our workout as a whole. This is important because if your cardiovascular system becomes a limiting factor during your working sets, then you're by definition not having your target musculature be the limiting factor. Thus, you are not able to create the most optimal hypertrophy response. So, we want to make sure that your cardiovascular system is more than capable of keeping up with the demands placed on it throughout your working sets. And lastly, we want to make sure that your central nervous system is not excessively fatigued going into these working sets. So, if what you're doing for your warm up creates a ton of systemic and central nervous system fatigue, such that you are not able to mentally and physically recruit a high amount of force and produce a high degree of performance simply due to systemic and nervous system fatigue, that is bad news. If we're being limited by our central nervous system and by our systemic fatigue rather than by our target muscles, then we are not able to create the forces or the stressors to the target muscles that are necessary in order to create the most robust hypertrophy stimulus possible. And so, to summarize, we want to avoid high fatigue in our target muscles, which does not create a robust hypertrophy response. So, it's not that we want to avoid fatigue in the target musculature on the whole, but we want to avoid non stimulative fatigue in the target musculature, going into our working sets. Next, we want to avoid fatigue in supporting musculature and our cardiovascular system and our central nervous system in order to ensure that our target muscles are the limiting factor throughout our working sets. So, an example of an ineffective warm up routine for, let's say, barbell back squats. I'll just run through an example of what one of my clients came to me with recently. They were doing some high intensity cardio and occasionally some plyometric exercises. They would do a few hard sets of some hip abduction exercises or glute exercises, and then some leg extensions. So let's get into why each of these things is just a bad idea. To start, doing high intensity cardio, or even worse, plyometric exercises going into your working sets of barbell back squats is simply a bad idea because you're creating a ton of both systemic and cardiovascular fatigue, such that when you're actually going and doing your working sets of barbell back squat, instead of the limiting factor being your glutes or your quads, it might be your cardiovascular system. Or worse, if you're doing plyometrics going into your barbell back squats, you have created such a high degree of fatigue in the target musculature of your glutes and quads in a way which does not actually promote more hypertrophy, that you're not able to create a high degree of performance. You're not able to generate a high amount of force in those target muscles, and thus your performance decreases significantly, and you're not able to create nearly the same hypertrophy response that you could have if you had just forgone the high intensity cardio or the plyometrics entirely going into this. Next, the few hard sets of abs to activate your core. All you're doing by doing hard sets of abs before you're doing something which actually requires your abs to perform is you're creating fatigue in your abs, meaning you're actually reducing their ability to perform going into your actual working sets of squats. So your actual core stability is significantly worse than what it would have been if you had just skipped the ab exercises altogether. Or if you really want to do ab exercises and strengthen your core over time, do them after the squats, after you've already used them for what you need them to stabilize through. Next, the hip abduction exercises or glute exercises to wake up your glutes. Your glutes aren't asleep. It's as simple as that. Your glutes aren't asleep. You cannot do a squatting motion without using your glutes. If you have trouble connecting to your glutes or feeling your glutes, maybe throwing in some things like hip thrusts after your barbell back squats can help you learn to feel your glutes and enhance your mind muscle connection with your glutes such that you're able to more effectively engage them in the future. But doing these exercises before your barbell back squat, if your goal is to perform optimally during your barbell back squat, is disadvantageous, such that similar to the ab exercises, you are simply fatiguing that musculature going into your barbell back squat, such that you're limiting their ability to perform at a high level. Now, if your goal is to most optimally grow your glutes, doing some sort of pre-exhaustion work before going into barbell back squat is an entirely acceptable way of doing things. You can do either some hip abduction or some glute isolation work, and then go into your barbell back squat and be further limited by your glutes during that. But if your goal is to perform as well as possible in the barbell back squat, then anything that fatigues the main movers of that lift to a high degree is simply inefficacious. And in the example that I'm using here, the client that told me he was doing all of this to warm up for his barbell back squat, his goal was not to grow his glutes. His goal was to perform as well as possible and be as strong as possible in the barbell back squat while minimizing injury risk. So for that specific goal, having hip abduction or glute isolation work leading into the barbell back squat was simply an ineffective and inefficient way of going about things. And lastly, leg extensions to reduce injury risk and get the knees warm going into the barbell back squat movement. Similar to the glute exercises leading into the barbell back squat, if your primary goal is to grow your quads, then doing some hard sets of leg extensions going into your barbell back squat in order to make your quads the limiting factor in your back squat, that is an entirely valid way of going about doing things. And especially if you're heavily limited by your lower back stability when doing these barbell back squats, making it so your quads are even more of a limiting factor can be a really effective way of maintaining the efficacy of the back squat via reducing the load that you have to use to get a good quad stimulus because your quads are already pre-exhausted. However, doing leg extensions before the back squat does not automatically prepare your knees for the loads of the back squat. The force vectors are entirely different, and you can't expect to simply do leg extensions and then go to a back squat and just be totally warm for it. You're still going to need to do some warm up sets in the back squat to be ready to lift your working weight. So at the end of the day, leg extensions are less effective for warming up the knees than are simply doing more warm up sets of the specific exercise that you're about to do, in this case, the back squat. So if you are prone to knee injuries, then instead of just doing more sets of leg extensions, simply doing more warm-up sets of barbell back squat is a far more effective way of preparing your knees to handle the loads and the force vectors that they will be experiencing during your working sets of back squat. And again, the person in question that I am referencing for this specific warm-up routine, their goal was not to maximally stimulate their quads. Their goal was to perform as well as possible in the barbell back squat with minimal injury risk. And having leg extensions as a pre-exhaustion exercise leading into the back squat in this specific case was not an effective way of going about things because they weren't trying to maximally stimulate their quads. They were trying to perform as well as possible in the back squat. So now let's walk through some practical examples of how to actually go about warming up for some different scenarios. And the first one, let's take some barbell bench press as the first exercise in a session with a planned working weight of 185 pounds for about 8 to 10 reps. So that's what you will eventually be aiming to do for your working sets. So how do you start? To start, I would probably just do the bar, the 45-pound bar, for like 12 to 15 reps. But really just starting to get the movement patterned in, get the blood flowing. But really, you're not creating any degree of fatigue because relative to your working weight, the load is so low that you're not going to create any fatigue. And you can really just start to get the movement patterned in. Next, I'd throw on probably 25-pound plates onto each side. So now we're at 95 pounds and drop the reps down to maybe 8 to 10 reps. So now you're able to start to feel what it's like to have the weight on the bar. You're dropping the reps down significantly, so you're still not providing any real high degree of fatigue. And it starts to give you the opportunity to engage your central nervous system and really activate your muscles so you can prepare them for the load and handling the load through the specific movement pattern that you're about to do. Next, I would throw on a plate and maybe 10s on each side. So now we're at 155 pounds. I would do that for a set of maybe 4 to 6 reps. So again, we're dropping the reps down significantly as we get closer to our working weight, such that we are still not creating any substantial amount of fatigue because the reps are dropping down so low. Yet we are able to really now feel the weight because we're getting substantially closer to our working weight. We're able to feel the weight and really practice moving that load through the given movement pattern. And then lastly, I would go up to the working weight of 185 pounds and do 2 to 3 repetitions. Again, such a small number of reps that the fatigue created is minuscule, yet you're able to handle the actual load that you're about to use for your working weight such that you are mentally and physically prepared to lift that weight. And you are now dialed in to the specific movement pattern that you're about to do for your working sets. So then after a couple minutes of rest, once you've gone through all of those warm-up sets, you're ready to go. You know exactly what the weight is going to feel like, and you are patterned into the specific movement pattern. So there's no fumbling around for the first few reps of the set and trying to figure out what to do. So that's an example with barbell bench press as the first exercise in a session with planned working sets of 185 pounds for 8 to 10 reps. Now, let's take a slightly different example. Dumbbell lateral raises later in the same session as we had just done the barbell bench presses from, after some other tricep work, and with planned working sets of 15-pound dumbbells in each hand, so 30 pounds total, and for sets of around 14 to 18 repetitions. Now, in this example, since this is later in the session and the target muscles for this exercise, the lateral delts, have already been used, at least in a stabilizing role, for previous exercises in the session. For example, with the barbell bench press, the lateral delts play a pretty significant stabilizing role. They're not entirely cold. And similarly, the total load that is being used here is significantly less and the number of repetitions is much higher, such that the actual stress that is being created in the joints is much lower. So the combination of already being quite a bit warmer and the absolute load being significantly less means that we likely don't need quite as much warm up as we did for the barbell bench press being the first exercise in the session. So for this, I'd probably start with, say, some 5-pound dumbbells, crank out maybe 10 to 15 reps. Then I'd go up to some 10-pound dumbbells, crank out another 5 to 8 reps, and then I'd grab my working weight of 15-pound dumbbells, crank out 3 or 4 reps, wait a couple of minutes, and then I'm good to go for my working sets. Again, the muscles being used here are already somewhat warm from previous exercises in that session, and the absolute load being used is relatively low. So the total amount of warming up that we need is not all that high. What really needs to happen here is that we just need to pattern in the specific movement pattern that we're doing and really ensure that blood flow is being delivered to the target tissues, as well as prepare our bodies to use the specific load through the specific movement pattern that is about to be done for the working sets. Next, let's move on to a quite different example of hack squats done on a leg day after a couple sets of leg curls and a couple sets of leg extensions in an individual who has a history of knee injury or strains and with a planned working weight of 360 pounds for sets of 10 to 12 reps, right? So I want to emphasize in this specific example, you've already done some leg curls and you've already done some leg extensions. What this means is that we already have pretty significant blood flow to the joints and connective tissue of the knees, as well as to the musculature in the quads and the hamstrings. And so really of relevance to the hack squat is that our quads and our knees are already quite warm. So what needs to happen here is that we need to prepare our connective tissue to handle the weight and the specific force vectors of the hack squat, such that we are significantly reducing injury risk, seeing as there's a history of knee strains in this individual. How do we go about doing this? In these instances, I tend to take the same approach, but simply extend it out a bit further. So instead of doing, say, 2 to 4 warm-up sets, I might instead take something more like 3 to 6 warm-up sets. This is actually something that I was doing in my last mesocycle, so I'll run through exactly what I would do. First, I would do a set of like 20 body weight squats. Incredibly high repetition. My body weight's around 200 to 205 pounds right now, and so decent load. And it's taking the knees through a very similar movement pattern and applying very similar force vectors as is going to be experienced in the hack squat. Then once I get into the hack squat, I'll load on a plate on each side, so 90 pounds plus however much the sled itself weighs. I'll pop out something like 10 reps. I'll put on another plate on each side, so now we're at 180 pounds. I'll go for something like 7 or 8 reps. Put on another plate on each side, so now we're at 270 pounds. Go for 5 or 6 reps. And then usually around here, this is when my knees will start to feel a little bit weird. And so if it's one of those days where my knees are feeling a little off, sometimes I'll go for another warm-up set at the same weight, at the same 270 pounds, for, again, another like 5 or 6 reps, before adding another plate on each side to equal 360 pounds total, and then going for the final warm-up set of 3 or 4 repetitions. And so by taking this extended warm-up and really feeling out how the joint in question and the joint of concern is feeling as we're doing so, we can ensure that we're ready to handle the load through the specific force vectors that are at play. And we can ensure that the joints and the connective tissue feel good while we're doing so, right? When you get to a certain level of strength, there's some level of pain and discomfort that is simply unavoidable, right? If you're just strong as hell and you're deadlifting like 600 pounds, that's not comfortable. That's not going to be comfortable. There's some level of pain and discomfort that is inherent in lifting high loads. However, we want to make sure that our joints and our connective tissue and our muscles are feeling as good as possible going into that in order to minimize injury risk and minimize the level of discomfort, while still being able to perform to a very high degree. And so you can see in the example of the hack squat warm-up that even though I'm taking a very extended warm-up compared to the other examples, I'm still doing it in a way which minimizes the fatigue so that I'm still able to perform for my actual working sets. And then lastly, the example of a deadlift for the first lift of a session, and we're preparing for a 1 rep max or a nearly 1 rep max. And we're preparing to do a single repetition of 405 pounds, which is very close to this hypothetical individual's 1 rep max. What does a warm up for this specific lift look like? Well, it could look like something along the lines of doing 5 to 10 repetitions with just the bar, putting a plate on each side. So now we're at 135 pounds, going for another 5 to 8 repetitions, adding another plate on the bar. So now we're at 225 pounds, going for maybe 3 to 5 repetitions, adding another plate on the bar. Now we're at 315 pounds and do maybe 2 to 3 repetitions. And then at this point, I would reduce the weight increment. So maybe add from here 25 pounds on each side. So now we're at 365 pounds. And from here, I would only do 1 rep. So I would do 1 rep at 365. I would add 10 on each side. So now we're at 385. I would do another single rep, add another 10 pounds on each side. So now we're at the 405 pounds. I would wait a couple of minutes. So now all of your systems are rested, they're ready to go. You've been primed from all of the warm up sets that you did up to that point, and now you're ready to go for that 1 rep single. So I hope those examples gave you a good idea of how to warm up for a wide variety of scenarios. And to summarize, the goal of a warm up is to prepare you to perform well for your working sets while minimizing injury risk, with the smallest fatigue cost and the minimum time investment possible. We want to minimize fatigue costs so that you're able to perform as well as possible. And we want to minimize the time investment so that you can have more time either just doing more stimulative work or just enjoying your life. And secondly, we want to accomplish all of this by using the specific exercise which you are about to perform your working sets with as your warm up for that exercise. And we do this by escalating load while reducing repetitions in order to prepare your central nervous system, your muscles, your connective tissue, and your joints to handle the load through the specific movement pattern you are about to do with the smallest fatigue cost possible. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something of value. Please like, comment, and subscribe to support the algorithm and the growth of this channel. And if there's anything you'd like to learn specifically in the future, anything you'd like me to make a video on, please don't hesitate to drop a comment and let me know what that is. Shoots.